Building the lessons learnt loop. Can this prompt-driven test automation system scale with complex applications using lessons learnt loops? In this example, I've taken a more complex application with more complex test steps, for example, drag and drop column names into sort and grid components in a framework called AG Grid, and we've got pop-out, slide-out menus, checkboxes in scroll panels, all sorts of complex scenarios. I've taken a recording of a particular scenario. I've used our existing tools to convert that into a markdown test case, and what we want to see is if we can automate this using our prompt-driven approach to test automation, using our discover, our learn, our generate and our validate commands. Now, one of the reasons I've picked this application is because I know from experience that some of this drag and drop complexity in this AG Grid application is really difficult to automate. I'm expecting this approach to struggle with some of these test steps, and what I want to see is if we can take a lessons learned loop and come up with solutions that we can reuse for some of the more complicated steps that we need to implement. So what I'm going to walk you through is this process that we've seen before, where we take our markdown test case that you've already seen. We use our discovery process to use the Chrome DevTools MCP to see if we can automate that. I'm expecting this to fail. I'm going to do some research using Claude Code's UltraThink capability and build out a lessons learnt markdown file that our learn, our generate commands can then use to automate some of the more complex test steps that we need to implement. And from this, we'll get a more advanced YAML execution script that will then be used in our validate and execution commands. Let's see how that works in practice. So the first step then was to run this discover command, and I've run that against the test case that came from the recording of me running through a test case with this AG Grid column component. And after the discover command had completed, as expected, I see that it's struggled with some of the row grouping drag and drop components, and the output from that is that it's not behaving in the way that our AI agent was expecting, in as much as I know from experience that it's a non-standard implementation of the drag and drop components, and when you drag one of the columns into the grouping panel, it can drag but it can't actually drop. So what we need to do now is actually start building out some lessons and approaches that can get around this issue. So I've run the create test case. We've got the test case. I've run it the first time, and as we've just seen, that failed, and it came up with some issues that it was going to have to actually automate those test steps. And now what I want to do is research and learn some lessons that we can then use for a second pass and attempt at getting this to work. And to do that, we can come back into Claude Code, and I can run this particular command. Please can you examine why the drag and drop for the row grouping didn't work? UltraThink, which gets Claude Code to really research why and how it can come up with solutions. And please write these solutions to the AG Grid lessons learned. So if I run that, and then we'll leave that, that'll take a few minutes to run, and we'll come back and we'll look at the document that Claude Code has produced from this prompt. So that took about 5 minutes, but the results from that are that it's discovered that AG Grid doesn't use native HTML5 drag and drop, uses an event handling approach. It's got multiple ambiguous drop zones and a sequence of events not triggered. So it has come up with the concept of using the AG Grid API directly for automation and using custom events, low-level mouse events, or hybrid approach. So those are the order or the recommended approaches: the AG Grid API first, and then some subsequent lower level or other ideas that it could use. And it has documented that in the AG Grid lessons learnt markdown file. And what we're going to do now that we have this document, quite a comprehensive document, I would review this in detail before proceeding, but for now and this experiment, what we'll do is we'll take that and we'll feed that in to a second attempt of our discover, learn, generate, validate approach. So what I've done now is I've started again with the discover command. I've cleared the context so that there's no previous memory, no knowledge of what we've done previously. We're reusing the discover command with that markdown test case, and I'm also feeding in the AG grid lessons learned. Let's run that and we'll see where we get to this time. So that discovery command is almost completed and it's gone through all of the test steps. It says that it matches exactly what was expected in the test case, and if we look at the AG grid application we can see that the actual drag and drop of the column for the grouping has actually worked in this instance. So off the back of this, our discover command should create us a discoveries document, which we should see appear in here any second now. There we go, and create that document. And in the discoveries document, we can then feed that into the learning command at the next stage. So we completed that first stage, and I did actually feed this lessons learned document back into the discover process, and I'm going to feed that document back into the learn and the generate process as well. So if we complete the learn stage next, so that it can go through all of the data that it picked up from the discovery session, and we do /learn from our commands, and we feed in the discovery log, and I'm going to feed in the AG grid lessons learned again, and we'll run that, and from that we should get our learnings document, which we can then feed into the generate command as we progress through this workflow. So that's successfully created our learnings document. So the next step then is to run the generate command, and the generate command will take in the lessons learned. It will take in the learnings from that, and actually we feed in the markdown test case as well, and that should give us our fixed YAML execution script. So let's try that step next. So first then I'm going to clear the context, and then I'm going to run the generate command, and that is /generate with the learnings from the last session, which is that file, the markdown test case, the original test case, and then the AG grid lessons learned, just that it's got that context as well for this stage of the process. So that stage is completed then, and we now have our spec file, our YAML file, that is our deterministic test script that should be executable by our AI coding tool with the Chrome DevTools MCP. So in here we've got test case 2, grid column management, grouping, variables, test steps, and this is the script we're expecting our validate command to run with and validate that it works successfully. So to complete that stage then, just first off, need to close down the browser that it was using. And once it's completed validating the YAML syntax, which is what's just gone off and done, we're now ready to move on to phase 4, which is to validate with the YAML file that's just created. But first off, we'll just clear the context. Oh, help if I spelled that correctly. /clear. And then we'll paste in this command, and we'll see if this YAML script with the lessons learned enables Claude Code to run this script end to end using some API calls to implement some of the more difficult test steps. And there we go. On completion, we've got our successfully executed YAML test script, and the validation results have been written to TC001 validation results. And I think we have a test case that is in a stable state, ready for us to run and try executing in a GitHub workflow. In conclusion then, I think pushing Claude Code to ultra-think and do a lot more deeper research has really paid off, and feeding that back in as lessons learned. It's a complex scenario, no code, we're still using really prompt driven with a YAML deterministic script for that execution. I'm still a little uncertain about how far that API approach can be taken, because ultimately the API approach is not testing what the end user is going to use, and the approach is very UI based. We've got no API, no database stuff stuck in there at the moment. But on the whole, successful experiment. The pattern we used then, that was really based around this initial discovery, and that discovery failed on the first pass, so we got Claude Code to do some ultra thinking, created this lessons learnt approach, which looked at all the AG grid documentation, pulled together a working approach with the API, and then we could feed that back in both to the discover, the learn, and the generate stages in order to create this fixed YAML execution script, which had steps that were implemented using some of the lessons learned. And that validation then successfully paid off, and if we did future runs with other different types of entities and components within AG Grid, we may want to go background that loop and add to those lessons learned. I still think there's a degree of testing to be carried out. I'd love to get this running in a GitHub workflow, run it 10, 15, 20 times and make sure we do have a consistent and reliable approach to running using Chrome DevTools. I'm also keen to see if we can just swap in and use Playwright MCP. That'll be another experiment that we'll try in a week or two's time. So finally then, this is really an approach I'm going to start scaling up and using in production environments for some aspects of my test automation. It's not going to cover everything. There's no API, there's no database in there at the moment. But if I was looking for a solution to help me catch up with some of the technical debt where I've not managed to keep pace with my automation goals, I think this is going to be a scalable, usable and reliable approach to deploy in production environments. Just finally, I will make these prompts available in a GitHub repo in the next week or so and pull together a README and instructions on how to deploy this, and perhaps you can give me any feedback and thoughts on your attempts to implement this.